Thank you, Mr. President. Just a brief retort to the manifestation of our dear colleague, Senator Gordon. As one of the petitioners in that case, I definitely feel an extreme dismay over the decision of the majority of the Supreme Court. And that's why, just like the other petitioners, I intend to file a motion for reconsideration within the proper period. Having said that, may I also take the position that notwithstanding the decision of the Supreme Court, this body, this institution, as an independent, co-equal, separate branch of government, can very well express its own stand or its own position on the matter. If ordinary citizens can take a stand on this matter of transcendental importance or grave national interest, with more reason that the Senate as an institution can express its own or can make a stand on the matter. We have done that in previous instances, in previous issues, like the issue on the need for the on the EDCA. The Supreme Court has a different decision, a different ruling, different from the sins of the Senate, which is the need for ratification of EDSA by the Senate. So I take that position that we can proceed to adopt this resolution. Thank you.
Senator Gordon is recognized.
If that is the case, Mr. President, then let us state here our positions individually without taking a vote. I don't mind that. At least there will be nobody sitting on the center line. If we do not agree with the Supreme Court, Mr. President, the lady from Bicol has already stated that she's going to file a motion for reconsideration. Equity or justice requires that the Supreme Court be given the chance to consider the motion for reconsideration, Mr. President. We should wait. Now, obviously, we don't want to wait, and obviously, there are people, I've heard the administration, and you know, I've had disagreements with this administration. I think my record speaks for itself here. And therefore, when this thing happens, when I hear the cabinet say, Secretary Lorenzana say, he has a 21-gun salute because he is President of the Republic. As far as I'm concerned, you can call him Pagulo or Pangulong Marcos. Put him to sleep, Mr. President. What I really disdain is up to now, Mr. Marcos still has a say on this country's politics. Let us learn from it. Let us avoid the mistakes of electing people who should not be elected or taking a position at the time when they're fooling around. Things, Mr. President. What is important, even in our political parties, is there still rationalization. Should not be elected or taking a position at the time when they're fooling around. Things, Mr. President. What is important, even in our political parties, is there still rationalization. The matters of state, Mr. President. In this matter, the matters of state, Mr. President. In this matter, Mr. out and argue the case in the Supreme Court. And I said, fine, you will hear no squawk from me. Go ahead and argue the case. And if you win, we will follow. But, Mr. President, she lost. She lost the Supreme Court, and he can stand up against the Supreme Court, albeit here, not a while ago. And I called the attention of my good friend, Senator Dillon. The other day, I was ambushed at the fact that the President was threatening to declare martial law, and if the Supreme Court does not decides against him, he might do something that is independent of the Supreme Court. That is why we should be careful. We must use the rules of the country, the separation of powers in this country properly. Let's go to the Supreme Court. When the COMELEC did not use the law that we enacted here in this Congress, I had to go to the Supreme Court and argue my case, not just once, but twice. In the last argument, we finally won, Mr. President. And so therefore, Mr. President, my plea is not for anybody. My plea is for the rule of law. My plea is to make sure that we send the right message. Like I say, the right message is for the people who are not in favor to speak up here and say, we're against it. And for those who are in favor, to say, let's put it to sleep or whatever they want to do. But to vote as a Senate sends a very bad signal that the Supreme Court seems to be a Marcos court. Mr. President, President Aquino has appointed many members of the Supreme Court, and so is Mr. Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo. We cannot categorize courts in this country. When I was in UP, that was the argument of the left. They will put you in a category. Tuta ka ni Marcos o bata ka ng Kano. That is wrong, Mr. President. The important thing is for us to argue our case in the proper forum. Let's argue each other. Don't call each other names. And that is why I did not vote for Mr. Trump, and therefore I will not recognize him. It creates only what? Time that is challenging the whole system of our country. We must show that we can win. We can do many things. You know, when we appear to investigate the police in this country, Mr. President, we also put ourselves on the line. We want to make sure that these people go to jail. And I think Mr. Lacson and I, system of our country, we must show that we can win. We can do many things. You know, when we appear to investigate the police in this country, Mr. President, we also put ourselves on the line. We want to make sure that these people go to jail. And I think Mr. Lacson and I, police force, Mr. President, that is a time for us to make an argument for reconsideration, and if the Supreme Court says that's it, then we follow. Does this mean, Mr. President, that we are now being called to vote on the issue that has already been decided by the Supreme Court without debate?
Yes, sir.
Because I find it unconscionable for us to debate something that the Supreme Court has already debated on. And while I do not agree fully with the Marcoses, or I do agree in part to the proposition, I cannot in conscience vote wisely on this matter. As far as I'm concerned, we should put Mr. Marcos to sleep permanently. And we're not burying him as a hero. As far as I'm concerned, we're burying him as a former president. Of course, it is up to them. If there are people who feel that there is opprobrium in the fact that he is being buried in the libingan ng mga bayani or as a president, then it's up to them to say so. But I don't think we should force each and every senator here to vote on a matter that cannot be decided fully. In the first place, I'm not protecting anybody here, but here we have people here who will say that they are for due process of law, and yet when it comes to due process of law here, there is no decision made against President Marcos, insofar as I'm concerned. And yet we are casting judgment on our part here. We're casting judgment without any court of law in this country saying that he is guilty of all these crimes. Now, for all you know, many of us feel, as we feel in all administrations, that there have been corruption. We know that. But we are still a government of laws, and therefore, Mr. President, I feel that we should at least, because it has taken so long, Mr. President, the greatest travesty that has been committed here, and our silence is deafening, and I've stood up before here, not only in this Congress, but in the previous Congress, is that we have allowed the people who killed President Marcos to escape. We do not know who had him killed as of this time. Mr. Aquino, Mr. President, sorry, you see, I feel that there has got to be closure. This is the first issue that must be resolved. You have had President Cory Aquino become president. You have had President Noynoy Aquino become president. The people who escorted Mr. Marcos out of the airplane are still around. And yet, Mr. Aquino, and yet, I'm very bad at names. I'm sorry. I hope you'll pardon my placement of names at times. But they're still alive, Mr. President. To me, it is robbing the people of a sense of justice that the perpetration of such inaction or such inability to find whoever killed him makes us feel weak, make us feel inadequate, adds to the complacency, adds to the apathy of our people. And so far as I'm concerned, when we do this, what kind of position will I take now insofar as, let's say, this policeman who barged into the jail and started killing these people? I mean, you remember in the middle of the investigation, I raised the issue whether they are properly supported. In every investigation here, I always ask whether the people under investigation has counsel in accordance with the Constitution, Mr. President. And fortunately, Mr. Lacson had already taken care of that. And so that is all in pursuit of fairness, of equity, of making sure that the rights of everybody is done. Now, in this particular case, Mr. President, you know, as I said earlier before, last week, we were also part and parcel of the Marcos administration, although we never were able to get done. You know, my mother was arrested without any warrant, and she was taken to Campo Olivas, and I had to fight it out with them, with General Tomas Diaz. Mr. President, during the time of the elections, we were abused. I mean, our people were hurt by other people identified with the candidate of Mr. Marcos at the time. I voted to ban Mr. Marcos when I was in the Constitutional Convention. I even wanted to ban those who accepted money from Mr. Marcos from voting out of delicadeza during that time, Mr. President. I don't have to have a brief here on whether I'm pro-Marcos or anti-Marcos, but in this light, Mr. President, I have to be consistent. I'm only speaking for myself. I have to be consistent as a matter of principle that we cannot just judge here, especially since the Supreme Court has already judged the Marcoses insofar as that is concerned, and I don't feel it is appropriate or proper for us in this Congress. Let the Justice Department, let the judiciary of this country handle that. Insofar as it is concerned, we are merely expressing our umbrage, or some of us are merely expressing their umbrage. Let it be off record then that the senators who feel umbraged by this decision state it on record. Let them deliver their presentation. But insofar as I'm concerned, I feel unqualified to make a judgment on a 9-4 decision of 9 to 5, huh? 9 to 5 decision, which is a major majority, Mr. President. I don't feel qualified. I don't have all the data. I don't have all the facts. And from what I've seen, people who are going after Marcos has fallen short. They've had to find justice in America. And to me, that is really a slap on the sovereignty of this country. Why can we never prosecute anybody in this country? And we have to resort to things like this, that we have to come out and express our umbrage. Parang we're barking like dogs upon a caravan that's passing by. And we never get justice, Mr. President. So, Mr. President, that is my feeling. I hope you will forgive me. My colleagues will forgive me. It comes from my heart. It comes from my mind, from my training as a lawyer. And therefore, Mr. President, I will have to say no to this resolution unless we can debate this further and find out what is going to happen here. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, may I now move on the previous question? There's a motion to adopt
we're treating that as part of the debates, as part of the objections. Senator
Yes.
De Lima is raising her hand. Senator De Lima is recognized.